Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the world of Willie Moretti, the colorful underboss of the Genovese crime family. Known for his sharp wit, loud personality, and unpredictable temper, Moretti brought both laughter and fear into every room he entered. He was a man of contradictions, friendly to entertainers, feared in the streets, and loyal to the mob until the very end. Before we start the story, like this video, we have a goal of 100 likes in this video. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Now, close your eyes. Imagine the smoke-filled lounges of New Jersey, the laughter that masked dangerous deals, and the empire of a man who lived fast, spoke loud, and left his mark on the underworld. Settle in, and let the story of Willie Moretti guide you into the night. He was born in the 1892 in southern Italy, and brought as a child to the New York area, part of that great tide of families who settled in crowded tenements and worked long days for short pay. English came slowly. Opportunity came slower. In those neighborhoods along the Hudson, you learned to read people before you could read newspapers. He picked up the rhythm of street life, the bargain and the bluff. A smile used as a shield. There were honest jobs, sweeping floors, hauling crates, pushing a handcart, but they didn't pay enough to lift a family beyond rent due and groceries on credit. The back rooms and corner tables where older men gambled looked like another world. He watched and remembered. By the time he was a young man, he had a talent that would define him. He was good with people. He could put a room at ease, crack a joke, make you feel included, then count the money on the table without missing a beat. That gift turned into an invitation. He started as a runner for bookmakers, carrying slips and cash between safe houses. He learned the horse tracks, the odds, the value of information arriving 5 minutes before anyone else had it. He learned to keep quiet. He learned who to greet and who to avoid. The line between legitimate nightlife and hidden rackets wasn't a line at all. It was a narrow hallway behind a door that opened if you knew which name to mention. Then came 1920, and with it the national ban on liquor. Prohibition was chaos, and opportunity blended together. In New York and New Jersey, the trade in illegal liquor ran from quiet dockside handoffs to trucks barreling through night streets, to bottles hidden under bar counters where music drowned out whispers. He didn't invent the business. He found his place in it. His skills, charm, nerve, logistics fit the moment. He helped arrange deliveries, guarded shipments, collected payments, and protected speakeasies that paid for someone to watch the door and keep the peace. The money was bigger than anything a warehouse job could offer. The risks were real, but so were the rewards. Connections formed quickly among the men who would shape the rackets for years to come. Willie became a North Jersey link for a network led in Manhattan by figures like Charles Lucky, Luciano, and Frank Costello, who built a modern structure out of what had been a turf war. New Jersey needed its own manager, someone who could settle disputes without letting them become news, someone who understood gamblers, dock workers, police officers, and club owners. He rose because he could meet with a tough crew in the morning and take a comedian to lunch at a nightclub in the afternoon, all without breaking stride. He wasn't just muscle, he was a fixer, a broker, a man who could make a phone call and have a room filled or emptied. During those prohibition years, his activities were what authorities called racketeering, dealing in alcohol that the law said shouldn't be sold, collecting protection payments from places that wanted quiet nights, organizing gambling in back rooms and on kitchen tables. Arrests came and went for men in that world. Raids scattered patrons and knocked bottles to the floor. If his name appeared in a police blotter or a court calendar, it didn't slow the business that much, because the business wasn't built around one bar or one card game. It was a web of small operations tied together by money and fear and favors. He learned how to spread risk, how to shift a card game 3 blocks away when the heat rose, how to keep a speakeasy open by knowing a ward leader's favorite song. When Prohibition ended in 1933, some expected the liquor racket to collapse, and all the tough guys to vanish. The opposite happened. The men who had learned logistics and influence moved their attention toward gambling, whose demand didn't depend on laws that could change with a vote. Willie was already steeped in that business. He organized bookmaking on horse races, supervised the numbers game in neighborhoods from Bergen to Passaic, and kept dice and cards rolling in clubs where bands played swing and waiters hustled plates to tables. If an owner wanted to install slot machines, he could help, and he could also suggest who to pay if anyone complained. Police records and newspaper stories from the 1,930 seconds describe a North Jersey landscape where illegal gambling flourished out in the open, with certain rooms understood to be off-limits to uniformed patrols except during scheduled cleanups. He built a reputation as the New Jersey arm of a larger syndicate associated with the Luciano family, which later took the name Genovese after a succession of leaders. Within that structure, he answered to allies like Frank Costello and worked alongside men such as Joe Adonis, each with their own specialties and territories. The division of labor kept money flowing and quarrels manageable. He had a say over who ran which card room, who got credit at which sportsbook, who paid how much each week to stay protected. He wasn't shy in public either. Unlike some counterparts who hid, he went to shows, sat at good tables, and tipped big. That visibility worried law enforcement and impressed entertainers who relied on steady bookings. He loved the stage lights, even if he never sang a note. Nightlife was his office, and the big rooms of North Jersey were his favorite settings. The Riviera in Fort Lee shone over the river, a glamorous venue where band leaders and comics worked to big applause. He didn't own the place outright, but many believed he had a stake, and even without ownership, he had influence that counted. If a rising act needed a crowd, he could make a phone call and fill the tables. If a performer needed cash up front, he could arrange it. The hospitality he displayed there, handshakes, drinks on the house, jokes told to the back row, wasn't just show. It was business, a signal to every owner and performer that the path to steady work ran through him. With nightlife came politics. A club didn't stay open late or host dice games unless someone in the local government chose to look the other way. Payoffs dressed up as donations, campaign support, or cash in envelopes bought peace. People in that ecosystem knew the price of cooperation and the cost of crossing it. Investigations later described envelopes passed in back rooms, favors traded for permits, and the informal understanding that certain addresses would not be visited by officers unannounced. Willie operated in that gray zone, the place where a wink at City Hall kept 100 roulette wheels spinning. This wasn't legal. It was simply how the system worked in that time and place, and he was one of the men who worked it best. The 1,930 seconds also brought the great New York crackdown on slot machines, led by Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. When New York smashed machines with sledgehammers, many of those boxes didn't vanish, they moved. New Jersey towns became a new market. Willie helped coordinate placements in taverns and clubs, where profit could be split and heat managed. A machine would appear for a month, then disappear before a raid, then return under a new owner's name. Cash from those machines mixed with cash from the horses and the numbers, and the total filled envelopes delivered to Manhattan bosses who expected their cut. His social circle widened to include singers and band leaders, especially those who came from the same neighborhoods along the Hudson. Frank Sinatra, born in Hoboken and launched by big bands before going solo, moved through the very rooms Willie oversaw. The two were seen together often enough that newspapers made note of it. Stories spread that when Sinatra wanted out of a controlling band contract in the early 1,940 seconds, Willie made sure it happened. The most sensational versions claimed a weapon was shown and a signature produced. Others said it was simply a hard conversation backed by the kind of pressure only a man like Willie could apply. Historians have argued about the details for decades, pointing out that some witnesses were telling tales years later, and that memories grow dramatic when microphones appear. What remains clear is that Sinatra knew him, benefited from rooms he influenced, and, according to many accounts, appreciated the help. Willie's role in show business was never just about applause. It was leverage. He understood that a star with fans brought crowded nights, and crowded nights turned into cash. All the while, the day-to-day churn of illegal gambling and related rackets continued. Bookmakers in New Jersey didn't set odds in isolation. They needed up-to-the-minute results and lines from around the country, a flow of information known as the wire service. Control over that flow was a national project for the syndicate, with connections to big city bosses and financiers. In New Jersey, Willie helped secure access to results, enforced rules among local bookmakers, and dealt with anyone who tried to undercut the network by freelancing. Enforcement could take many forms, and in that era, threats were part of the toolkit, but the goal was stability. No shootouts in public, no headlines that forced politicians to act. He favored meetings, warnings, and agreements, backed by the knowledge that failing to comply would be costly. Law enforcement watched. In New Jersey, county prosecutors and state police pursued bookmaking and numbers operations with periodic intensity. Raids turned up notebooks listing bets, cash drawers stuffed with small bills, and phones dedicated to taking wagers. Willie's name surfaced in investigative files as the man behind this club or that crew. Sometimes he was detained, questioned, or charged over gambling. Sometimes the case failed, a witness recanted, or the fine was so modest it felt like a license fee. Police frustration showed in interviews where they complained that juries didn't treat betting slips like a menace. When the public sees wagering as a pastime, it's hard to make the man behind it seem like a villain, especially when he is known for picking up dinner tabs and telling jokes. By the end of the 1,930 seconds, his status was fixed. The New Jersey representative for a family headquartered across the river, a high earner trusted by leaders like Frank Costello, a man whose phone calls were returned. He had a home in the suburbs, a taste for nice suits, and an open manner that set him apart from the shadows in which his world usually moved. He could be seen at charity dinners, at boxing matches, at Broadway shows. Reporters described him as gregarious. To friends, he was generous. To rivals, he was shrewd. To the police, he was the problem behind 100 storefronts where money changed hands in ways the law didn't permit. That visibility brought risk. Newspapermen knew his face and wrote his name. Young toughs sought his favor to build their own reputations. Actors, band leaders, and agents courted him because he could make their calendar fill up. Politicians tolerated him because he kept trouble quiet. It was a delicate balance, but for years he kept it. If there was a rule he believed in, it was to keep business separate from home life, to make sure that at the end of the night, the lights went off without sirens and everyone made the next show. He had no illusion that the arrangement would last forever. Federal attention drifted toward gambling syndicates in the late 1,940 seconds. Senators wanted headlines, and television gave them a stage. Willie's combination of fame and informality ensured that, when the moment came, he would find himself under those hot lights, facing questions that would test the habit of a lifetime talk as if nothing mattered, say nothing that matters, and walk out smiling. But that moment was still ahead. For now, he was North Jersey's man, a broker of bets and bookings, the link between the smoky back room and the bright front of the house where a crooner sang a ballad and couples forgot, for an hour or two, the world outside. The war years made the riverfront feel busier than ever. Troop trains rattled through Jersey stations, factories hammered day and night, and every payday brought a new stream of cash into bars, pool rooms, and diners. Willie moved through that crowded landscape with the same easy stride he'd had since Prohibition, a familiar face under a fedora, a hand on a shoulder, a wink to a bartender already reaching for a phone. He had a habit of talking to everyone: waitresses, cab drivers, stagehands. People told him things without thinking twice, and information kept his bottom line steady. When a bookmaker needed a safe room and a reliable phone line, he knew which tavern had a back office with a door that didn't creak. When a club owner worried about a patrol captain coming by too often, he knew who to call to ease the visits and give the floor show time to finish. It was the same skill set that had made money during Prohibition, turned toward gambling now that the bar shelves could be legally stocked. The business changed shape, but not rhythm. In the back rooms, the numbers game ran morning to night, a neighborhood lottery that offered hope on a few digits and paid out in cash the next day. Runners strolled block to block, picking up slips with yesterday's newspapers tucked under their arms. On race days, the phones rang hard, wagers piling up as post time approached at tracks from Jamaica to Hialeah. Odds moved with the money, and the only way to stay alive was to know the line as quickly as the big rooms in Manhattan knew it. That meant access to The Wire, the private news stream for bookmakers that delivered results and point spreads in near real time. Long before television, that wire connected Newark, Jersey City, and Hoboken to Chicago and New Orleans. Reports sent by teletype clacked into little offices, hidden behind cigar counters and soda fountains. Everyone who ran action in North Jersey understood that if you didn't have those numbers first, you were betting blind. National players wrestled for control of that flow. The Annenberg Empire had built a fortune by selling racing information, then fell under a tax case that shook that network. Others stepped in to manage the service. In that shuffle, local bosses made sure their own access stayed secure. Willie's job was not to run a telegraph company, but to keep his bookmakers connected, enforce who could buy the service in his territory, and settle disputes between those who wanted to cut their own deals. That enforcement ran on reputation, meetings, and a ladder of warnings that didn't spill into public brawls. He preferred conversation to chaos. The line he drew was simple: don't bring heat, pay on time, follow the agreed rules. Break that code and you'd find doors closed to you. Keep it and you'd make a living. He wasn't a ghost. Day after day he could be found in the open rooms that defined Jersey nightlife. At the Riviera perched above the river, showgirls crossed the stage in a bright line, and comics threw punchlines out over candlelit tables. He liked a chair near the floor, back to a wall, so he could see who came and went. That room was more than entertainment. It was a meeting place where agents tried to place their clients, band leaders hunted for bookings, and owners bartered over split percentages. Willie thrived in that mix. He could smooth a disagreement with a line that made everyone laugh, then seal a deal with a handshake and a promise. Performers learned that if he said a date would be held, the lights would be on when they arrived and the envelopes would be ready at the end of the week. Stories spread that he could do more than book a weekend. In the early 1940s, when Frank Sinatra left band work to go on his own, rumors grew around how a binding contract loosened. Tales later told claimed Willie visited the band leader, made the case that the singer should be free, and ensured the paperwork moved. One colorful version pictured a weapon laid on a table and a signature following quickly. Other accounts insisted that no threat was needed, that industry pressure and money handled it. Biographers and historians have argued over those details for decades, some calling the most dramatic versions folklore that grew in the telling. What is well documented is the friendship. Sinatra knew him, played rooms he influenced, and moved in social circles where his name opened doors. It suited Willie's sense of theater to be seen helping a hometown star. A packed house didn't just sound good. It meant every table spent freely, the band got paid, and his slice grew. Beyond show business, his real strength was marshaling gambling across counties without letting it erupt into street fights. He and Joe Adonis coordinated closely, Adonis having deep ties in Bergen and beyond, as well as longtime connections in Brooklyn. Their alliance worked because each understood boundaries. This club would host cards. That neighborhood would be reserved for the numbers. Those phones would take race bets in the afternoon, and everyone involved would know precisely whom to pay and when. Money moved up in steady, predictable envelopes. Favors moved down just as reliably legal help after a raid, a character witness if a case reached court, an introduction to a lawyer who specialized in smoothing impossible problems. Police and prosecutors took swings whenever the public mood demanded action. A county cleanup might announce dozens of arrests in a single evening, with reporters invited as officers carried stacks of betting slips to police vans. Names like his would appear in print as questioned or held, and judges would set fines or short sentences in municipal jails. It happened in cycles. A mayor needed headlines. A prosecutor wanted to show he was tough. The operations would close for a week, then reopen quietly with a new name on the lease and the same crowd at the tables. The sums imposed by the courts rarely outweighed the profits, and juries were not always eager to jail working men for placing a bet on a horse. It frustrated law enforcement, but it reflected the way ordinary people saw the racket. Illegal, yes, but routine. Another stream of income came from machines. After New York's mayor smashed illegal slots, those cabinets didn't all end up in landfills. Plenty found new homes in New Jersey taverns and luncheonettes, sometimes recast as trade stimulators to dodge the letter of local ordinances. Willie helped place them, arranged collections, and made sure the split between owners, operators, and the network above them stayed clear. Machines would appear for a season, disappear before an inspection sweep, then reappear 2 towns over. The trick was to keep the hum of profit low enough that no one in a city hall felt foolish for overlooking it. Politics threaded through every piece of that life. You could not run a wide bookmaking network without some measure of understanding with officials. Donations turned up on campaign reports with handwritten notes that said, "Friends of the Club." Tickets to benefits were bought by the handful. Local organizations found anonymous envelopes covering the cost of uniforms for a youth baseball team or hot meals after a winter storm. It wasn't generosity alone, though he liked being thanked from a stage. It bought goodwill and time. In return, inspections might be scheduled rather than sprung, and warnings would arrive before a raid. Investigations later described that system as corruption. Willie treated it as the price of staying in business without scaring the neighbors. World War II brought federal attention to the docks and rail lines, and while there has never been public proof that he played a role in national port security arrangements, the proximity of his territory to the waterfront meant he kept a close eye on who was asking questions. More soldiers on leave meant more spending on the nights they were off duty, and the clubs leaned into that demand. Singers belted out sentimental favorites, comics kept spirits up, and the dice tables in the back ran a little longer when paychecks were fresh. He moved through those rooms in a tailored suit with a flower in the lapel, greeting returning customers like old friends and new patrons like family. That warmth wasn't put on. He enjoyed people. That was part of why he stood out in his world. He seemed to be having fun, even while everyone knew he was there to make sure the gears kept turning. After the war, the leadership picture across the river shifted. Lucky Luciano had been deported, and Frank Costello became the public face of a family that kept a low profile by design. Vito Genovese returned from Italy with ambition, and New York's internal struggles began to simmer. In that climate, Willie's allegiance to Costello mattered. He was not merely a revenue producer, he was a vote, a voice, and a stabilizing North Jersey presence who could guarantee income without spectacle. When disputes flared between factions uptown, he kept the bridge open, sending money and messages, careful always to avoid becoming a headline that could be used by rivals. His personality made him memorable. Reporters who caught him outside a courthouse got a wisecrack instead of a scowl. Photographers found him willing to grin into a lens. Rivals called him the Clown Prince because he liked to kid around, but the joke never hid the ledger he carried in his head. He knew which cafe owed 2 weeks' worth of protection, which bookmaker had pushed beyond his authorized street and needed to be pulled back, which cop's retirement party should be attended because the man had been discreet for years. That attention to detail allowed him to operate without the constant bloodshed that marked earlier eras. It wasn't peace, it was control. There were charges. In several counties through the late 1,930s and 1,940s, he faced accusations related to bookmaking or policy slips. Some cases ended with fines. Others fizzled when witnesses proved unreliable. A few arrests seemed designed only to show activity, with no follow-through. He retained good lawyers, made bail quickly, and treated courtroom appearances partly as theater. The lesson he drew was that as long as violence stayed out of public view and community institutions kept getting their envelopes for dances and parades, the appetite for a full-scale war on gambling remained limited. That calculus, repeated across the country by others like him, helped illegal betting thrive in plain sight. He also cultivated a network in the entertainment world that gave him leverage beyond New Jersey. Managers and promoters in Manhattan valued him for filling a room on short notice. If a new act needed a boost, he could stack the audience with people who laughed loudly and applauded hard. He loved discovering that a young comic he liked on a Tuesday was drawing a line out the door by Friday. To a singer, a week like that could change a career. To him, it meant leverage when he needed a favor called in across the river. He never pretended he ran the big houses in Times Square, but he made sure those houses respected North Jersey's contribution to their bottom lines. His home life stayed off the front page. He maintained a household across the Palisades and kept his family out of the clubs when he could. Friends described dinners where he told stories without naming names, where he played host as if the living room were a stage. He was generous with gifts and invitations, and in return he expected loyalty. Within his circle, a broken promise mattered more than a bad night's take. He could forgive lost bets. He had no patience for someone who spoke out of turn. By the late 1940s, the national mood had shifted. Wartime unity gave way to a hunger for reform that touched every institution from City Hall to the unions to the rackets. Television arrived in American living rooms, and the glow of that new screen promised that distant scandals could feel immediate. A young senator from Tennessee named Estes Kefauver built a committee to investigate organized crime across the country. The hearings were designed for newspapers and TV cameras, with big city stops that would make headlines. New Jersey, with its thriving gambling scene and notorious night spots, could not be ignored. Subpoenas landed on desks across the state. Some men ducked. Some pleaded poor health. Willie, by nature and by calculation, did not hide. Before the microphones found him, State-level inquiries had already begun nibbling at the edges. Grand juries called low-level runners and managers. The aim was to map the network and push witnesses to name names. That pressure moved upward. He read those signs clearly. Quiet warnings floated through his world. Keep your mouth shut, or at least keep it safe. He nodded, joked that he knew which questions to answer, and promised to stay within the unspoken rules that had governed the underworld for decades. At the same time, a more personal problem hovered. Friends noticed he repeated stories. He lost his train of thought sometimes. He'd always been relaxed around reporters, but now he was looser, too loose for men who valued silence above charm. Rumors whispered that an old illness was catching up with him. Physicians who treated him were said to be worried. In a business that relies on airtight confidence, a man who talks too freely becomes a liability. No matter how beloved, he shrugged off those concerns with his usual humor. He told companions he would be fine. He said showmanship never hurt him, and that a good line could get you through a bad interview. It was bravado. It was also the only way he knew how to be. Meanwhile, his day-to-day schedule barely budged. Bookmakers kept calling. Club owners asked for advice about who to book next month. Anxious managers wanted reassurances that a show could run even as hearings filled the newspapers. He kept the calendar full. When a bureau decided to raid a poker room to make a point for a headline, he moved the game 2 floors down and changed the entrance. If a town council threatened to close an after-hours spot, he arranged a charity night, invited local leaders, and let them see how much business the place brought in. He was at heart a negotiator. In a better world, he might have been a union leader or a theatrical impresario. In this world, those talents served a network that broke laws he did not dispute. He understood that a public spotlight would soon follow him into those rooms. Cameras loved him. That was a curse as much as a gift. He had cultivated a larger-than-life persona without ever stepping on stage. Juries liked him. Waiters adored him. He picked up checks, told stories, and embraced the role of the charming outlaw in an era that had made such figures folk characters. That persona would carry him into a hearing room where charm and danger would collide. Allies warned him that the old codes say little, laugh a lot might not work under oath. He brushed off the advice with a grin that had disarmed tougher men than any senator. The man who could make a whole nightclub lean forward believed he could handle a committee. Even so, the edges of his empire showed strain. Generational changes brought ambitious younger men who didn't value the old balance. The national struggle inside New York's families created currents that ran under every conversation. Slots brought heat in towns that wanted to promise voters they were now clean. Lawyers who had always taken his cases started to talk about federal investigators with sharper teeth and longer memories. A run of bad headlines could undo years of careful community management. He bet that his connections, his easy manner, and the public's tolerant attitude toward gambling would carry him through. Up to that point, that bet had always paid. He saw no reason to change his play just because television had arrived. The subpoenas were followed by preparatory interviews. Investigators came with folders of clippings and transcripts of tapped calls and testimony from small-time operators, hoping for leniency. They knew a lot and guessed even more. He gave them politeness and not much else. The record shows charges filed here and there for gambling operations tied to his name, but no sweeping case that stuck beyond fines and suspended terms. That pattern bred confidence on his side and frustration on theirs. The emerging national audience would soon learn his face and his voice. The man they met would be the unhindered version, the host of every room, the wit who hid a ledger in his pocket, the New Jersey broker who had made a career out of keeping the rails smooth while others chased credit in the shadows. Through it all, the truth remained simple. He broke laws for a living, and he did it with a smile that blurred the lines between villain and neighbor. He managed an illegal economy that employed bartenders, runners, doormen, musicians, and chauffeurs who saw in him not a threat but a paycheck. The state saw a problem to be solved. The public saw a character who fit into a landscape of neon signs, toll booths, and club posters pinned to kitchen walls. That duality, beloved and hunted, visible and untouchable, could not last forever. The year would come when he would sit under lights, tap the microphone, crack a joke, and make a nation wonder how a man like that could exist in the open. For now, the river sparkled at night. The roulette wheels turned where they shouldn't. The envelopes moved in predictable paths, and the host of North Jersey's hidden rooms kept every plate spinning with a grin no one could forget. Television turned hearings into theater. In a Newark chamber packed with spectators and wires snaking across the floor, he took a chair, straightened his tie, and treated the moment like a night at a club. Senators leaned forward, staff attorneys stacked folders, photographers jockeyed for angles. He did what he always did in a tense room, smiled, joked, and made everyone feel as if they'd met him before. He didn't stonewall the way some did. He admitted to knowing people the newspapers labeled racketeers, acknowledged a long involvement with gambling, and drew chuckles even as he sidestepped anything that could lock him to a specific act on a specific night. Viewers at home saw a New Jersey character who looked like half the men they'd seen in spiffy suits at weddings and ball games. To law enforcement, that ease felt like insult. To old friends across the river it looked like risk, because charm on television doesn't change the fact that those answers were now on film. Reporters wrote that he took the heat better than anyone, a natural performer who turned a scolding into a routine without ever raising his voice. Counsel pressed him on bookmaking chains, names behind room fronts, and the flow of numbers slips from tenement to counting rooms. He'd nod, concede that such things existed in his backyard, and insist he was a small piece, a better among betters, a man who liked horses and card games who happened to know everybody. He addressed senators politely, said he wanted no trouble, and then delivered a zinger that set the gallery laughing. The committee wasn't laughing. They cared less about personality than about threading lines between territories and bosses. He gave just enough to seem cooperative and then pulled back. The result was a day's worth of headlines that made him famous beyond North Jersey's nightlife. That performance did real damage in his own world. The old code demanded silence. You didn't joke with government lawyers. You didn't make problems for allies by naming acquaintances, even if you offered no details. You didn't fulfill a subpoena with a smile. Senior figures in Manhattan heard about the broadcast before it ended. Some were furious. Others were worried. Frank Costello, whose public posture leaned toward calm and influence, saw a cousin whose health and habits were becoming a liability. Vito Genovese's camp, restless and ambitious, saw a weakness in Costello's circle. New Jersey needed someone who could collect money and keep his mouth closed. Willie had always provided the first part with style. Now the second part looked shaky. The hearing also hardened official interest. County prosecutors in Bergen, Hudson, and Passaic dusted off case files. Investigators raided phone rooms tied to race bets, hauled in clerks from storefronts that had 2 telephones and no customers, and staged displays of seized ledgers on courthouse steps. Trial calendars filled with bookmaking counts. He faced indictments in separate jurisdictions tied to wagering, wire use, and club operations, predictable charges that in earlier years often ended with fines or suspended terms. He hired capable lawyers, posted bail, and kept moving, reassuring partners that his world had always survived waves of enforcement, and would survive this one too. Judges still listened to arguments that these were victimless violations. Juries still included bettors who saw themselves behind those tables. Even so, the number of charges rising at once created pressure he could feel. Behind the scenes, his peers tried to rein him in. Friends asked him to step out of the spotlight, skip interviews outside courthouses, keep visits to flashy rooms to a minimum, and stop playing friendly with reporters who loved a quote. He tried. Then he'd see a familiar photographer and wave him over, as if a smile and a one-liner could soften an entire city's suspicion. That impulse, harmless in ordinary times, became dangerous under bright lights. The committee's counsel, a sharp lawyer with a television-ready presence, treated him like a puzzle. A jovial man at ease in public, who was also a critical link in a revenue machine. The more he joked, the more the counsel pressed. He did not exist in a vacuum. North Jersey was a patchwork of crews and alliances, and keeping peace meant constant negotiation. Newark's underworld had long included figures outside his Italian circle, notably Longhi Zwillman, who ran a broad enterprise that touched everything from liquor to unions. The two managed a border of sorts. Willie's heaviest footprint sat in Bergen and along the Hudson's Palisades, with tendrils into Hudson County, while Zwillman's strength sat in Newark and parts of Essex. They did business when it suited them, kept distance when it didn't, and avoided overlapping in ways that would spark expensive trouble. That arrangement allowed both to make money while their neighbors lived with the reality that illegal bets, machines, and backrooms were as much a part of the landscape as ferries and trolley tracks. His core revenue in those years stayed consistent. Horse action, local lottery play, cards and dice behind restaurant doors, and coins from machines rebranded as amusements. The race wire remained a battlefront. National service providers wanted exclusivity, and local bosses wanted control over who could plug into those results. He enforced territorial limits so that one bookmaker didn't undercut another by offering faster lines or better payouts. You paid for access, you didn't poach outside approved streets, and you didn't stiff winners. When someone broke those rules, he preferred a quiet sit-down and a warning over a loud scene. If a room needed to close for a while, he made it happen. If a clerk needed a lawyer after a sweep, he arranged counsel. It was coordination, not chaos. And that distinction kept violence down and profits steady. Pressure from federal agencies followed the TV glare. Treasury agents examined tax returns. Postal inspectors looked at communications linked to betting lines. Justice Department lawyers tracked connections between New Jersey operations and national figures already on their radar. A man who had once only dealt with county detectives now received visits from people with federal badges and long memories. He kept his routine, shook hands in public, tipped hotel staff generously, and treated every encounter as a chance to charm. That behavior seemed brazen to some, but it sprang from the calculation that the public did not fear gambling the way it feared other rackets, and that friendly manners disarmed critics. It had worked for years. He hoped it still would. At the same time, his health worried friends. He began losing threads in conversation, repeating lines, and answering questions with tangents that made sense only to him. Men who'd grown up with him understood what those signs meant. In that era, long before modern treatment, an untreated infection could reach the brain and change a man's personality. Doctors who examined him quietly spoke of deterioration. Within his world, that diagnosis carried a harsh consequence. Talkativeness and confusion made him unsafe to keep in the highest seat in New Jersey. That conclusion wasn't personal. It was survival logic in a culture built on keeping secrets. Frank Costello's allies tried to protect him. They placed buffers between him and sensitive meetings, reduced what he carried in his head, and urged rest. He brushed it off, made a crack about needing a vacation, and went back to his rounds. His entertainment tease didn't vanish. The Riviera in Fort Lee continued to be a showcase for national acts, and he kept his influence there, helping managers plug gaps in calendars and smoothing disputes over splits and billing. He had always liked helping a comedian sharpen a set or advising a crooner on how to choose a closing number for a Jersey crowd. He wasn't an artist, but he knew what a Saturday in Bergen sounded like. For him, the business of fun paid better than the fun itself, and that sensibility made him popular with agents who didn't love dealing with club owners, but always answered his calls. Stories about his role in Frank Sinatra's early contractual battles continued to circulate, often in breathless detail. By 1950, those tales had hardened into lore. That he had leaned on the right person at the right time and cleared the way for a hometown kid to go solo. No court file proves a threat, but the rumor never died because it fit his public image. The affable fixer, who could open doors through personal presence rather than courtroom motions. Sinatra, now a star, avoided discussing it in public. Willie didn't rehearse the story either. He liked being seen as the man who had helped artists, because that identity made him look like a patron rather than a predator, and it fit his own sense that he kept things moving in a way that benefited a lot of people. While hearings roared and newspapers filled columns with diagrams of syndicates, routine still ran the streets. Numbers writers woke early and visited coffee counters. Race bettors phoned in a few minutes before post time. Cafe owners counted coins from machines before lunch. Police schedules remained predictable enough that a call often reached a back door before officers reached the front. He had built that predictability, and he tried to maintain it even as state houses promised reform. Business owners who dealt with him saw in that steady hand a kind of order that, while illegal, kept arguments from becoming headlines. He never pretended to be honest. When questioned about life choices by people outside his circle, he'd say he did work others were willing to use, while pretending they didn't. He saw hypocrisy in that, and used it to defend the world he managed. Yet he understood consequences. He knew prison remained a possibility. He'd done short stints, paid fines, and sat for endless arraignments. Those experiences taught him that keeping blood out of the news and avoiding fights near schools and churches made life easier for everyone. Part of his authority came from enforcing those boundaries within his own crews. The Kefauver tour moved on after Newark and New York. It left behind a public newly aware of organized gambling and a roster of names familiar to millions. Willie had become one of those names. The committee's final report traced how national services connected to local rooms, how profit flowed to bosses who rarely touched a betting slip, and how corruption in city halls kept it going. The report didn't name every person it described, but everyone in his world could read between the lines. Governors vowed to clean up. Mayors promised tighter control. Police chiefs posed with smashed machines. On the ground, though, demand never fell. Wagers kept coming, and as long as that remained true, someone would meet the demand. He intended for it to remain him. His relationship with Joe Adonis mattered more as the months passed. Adonis, charismatic, flashy, and with one foot always poised to step onto a bigger stage, had long-standing influence in parts of Bergen and beyond, as well as deep Brooklyn roots. Federal authorities dug into Adonis's immigration history and his rackets, and that pressure forced him to reduce exposure. When a figure of Adonis's scale retreats, territory shifts. Willie had to guard his lanes without inviting war, an art he had practiced for years, but now had to manage while fighting his own public relations problem and health issues. He delegated more. He leaned on trusted lieutenants who knew which cafes and betting apartments mattered most. He tried to teach a younger generation how to keep the peace while collecting the take. Throughout this period, he remained visible in courtrooms. There were more gambling complaints, more accusations that he supervised policy joints and tournament nights, more claims that he had bribed officials to look elsewhere. Defense counsel fought counts one by one, attacking searches, questioning identification, and pointing out that witnesses sometimes mixed up who they'd seen in a low-lit room. Some cases ended in fines. A few were dismissed. None dismantled his influence entirely. The gray economy he managed was resilient because it was spread across many addresses with flexible schedules and layers designed to survive losses. Neat narratives often fail in real life, and his was no exception. He was not a cartoon villain or a secret philanthropist. He was a businessman in an illegal market who used personal warmth, intimidation by reputation rather than display, and a dense web of relationships to keep money moving. He cultivated politicians with contributions wrapped in community spirit. He courted celebrities because a good review and a gossip column could do as much for a club as a new roulette layout. He joked with cops and held grudges against men who talked out of school. He listened to band leaders, bartenders, and chauffeurs, because every one of them could deliver information worth more than a full room on a Friday. As 1,951 opened, he felt currents tugging in opposite directions. Television fame had made him a household name. Health made him unpredictable. Friends pleaded with him to travel or lay low. Enemies waited to see if he'd slip again in public. Allies across the river debated whether he could be salvaged or whether he presented too much danger to a quiet life. He still made his rounds, shaking hands in familiar restaurants, talking up acts booked for summer, asking after families, and reassuring bookmakers that nothing fundamental had changed. He'd built a life on the idea that personality could solve almost anything. The world around him was beginning to disagree. The spotlight he had treated like a toy began to burn. After the hearings, his phone didn't stop. Old friends called with careful phrases about taking it easy. Lawyers advised him to decline interviews and let counsel do the talking. Politicians who had once been happy to be seen shaking his hand now waved from across a room and excused themselves. He tried to adapt. He skipped a few front tables, sat farther back in clubs he loved, and dodged reporters outside courthouses for a week or two. Then habit pulled him forward again. He'd spot a familiar camera, tilt his hat, and toss a line that made people smile, as if the whole country hadn't just watched him charm a Senate panel while acknowledging a life built on gambling. That personality had been his greatest asset. Now it drew heat every time he used it. The official response only accelerated. Across Bergen, Hudson, and Passaic, prosecutors dusted off dormant investigations. Detectives raided storefronts that existed mainly to hide phones used for race bets. In cheap apartments above delicatessens, officers found notepads, adding machines, and slips marked with the last 3 digits of the day's numbers play. Patrolmen carried boxes to vans while photographers recorded the piles. Grand juries asked witnesses to map who reported to whom, which apartments held ledgers, which taverns kept machines in back rooms. He faced multiple indictments tied to bookmaking, conspiracy, and running lotteries. Bail was posted quickly. Lawyers filed motions attacking searches, challenging warrants, and arguing that seizing slips from a coat pocket in a crowded room did not prove he ran the whole enterprise. He had lived through these cycles before. He was right that many charges would end with fines or dismissals. He was wrong to think this wave felt like the last. The structure he helped maintain was no secret to people in those towns. A numbers bank in one neighborhood paid out cleanly, earned a reputation for honesty, and fed money up the chain. A bookmaking room took wagers on tracks in 3 states and made sure its line matched the national service so the house didn't get crushed by late swings. Dice games rolled behind restaurant doors after the dinner rush, while a man at the front greeted passers-by like any ordinary proprietor. Machines disguised as amusements took nickels and quarters and gave out free plays instead of cash to satisfy an ordinance, while everyone knew the real settlement happened at the register. He coordinated it all. He didn't pretend it was legal. He insisted it be orderly. He settled disputes through sit-downs, moved a game if a neighbor complained, paid for a church festival, sponsored uniforms for a youth team, and expected discretion in return. He also extended credit at steep rates when a bookmaker got hit hard, or a club owner needed to bridge a slow month, a sideline common in his world. The combination gambling, machines, protection, loans formed one ecosystem with his phone at the center. The Kefauver spectacle raised the stakes inside the slash-and underworld, not only with law enforcement but with men whose patience had limits. The old guard valued invisibility. He had never been invisible. His smile and public ease made him a folk figure, a trait tolerated as long as money arrived and no secrets leaked. After the hearing, the jokes looked like cracks in a dam. Men who had sat quietly through raids and trials watched a cousin of Frank Costello treat a televised interrogation like a club routine. They whispered that his judgment had slipped. The whispers were not unkind, which made them more dangerous. They were the talk of men who had decided a friend had become a risk. Health sharpened those fears. For months, people close to him had noticed changes. He forgot names he used to recall instantly. He told the same story twice in an hour. A question that required a crisp answer sometimes got a rambling reply. In private, doctors described a degenerative condition that in that era often went untreated until it altered a person's mind. Word like that, spoken softly, spread fast. In a business that runs on confidence and nonverbal understandings, a man who could not always track a conversation became a liability. Friends tried to shield him. They steered him to social settings rather than strategy sessions. They took meetings he once would have run. He pushed back, anxious to prove he hadn't lost a step, and leaned into the only defense he trusted: good humor and the warmth of an old host greeting a room he felt was his. Through it all, the clubs he loved kept booking acts. The Riviera perched over the river stayed bright, a room where big bands set up behind glittering stands and comics worked through punchlines that carried the entire floor. He was there often, not just for the show, but for the business beneath it. Agents brought in singers needing a crowd. Managers wanted an extension on a week that had filled too fast. Owners asked, quietly, whether they should move a roulette layout out of sight until a cleanup passed. He gave out advice and favors that tied entertainment to the economy behind it. His reputation as a man who had helped Frank Sinatra in the early 1940s stuck to him like cologne. Different versions of that story ran in columns and conversations, some claiming that he applied pressure to loosen a contract that held the singer to a band, others saying the matter was handled with payouts and negotiations. Biographers later picked apart details. What remained uncontested was their connection. Sinatra from Hoboken had sung in rooms he influenced, and their paths had crossed more than once. Those ties kept his name in gossip columns even when he tried to keep his face out of news pages. Legal calendars crowded. In Hudson County, he and associates were charged with overseeing betting phones. In Bergen, prosecutors pursued allegations linked to policy slips collected from barbershops and cafes. In Passaic, investigators pressed a case claiming that several taverns were fronts for machine collections and weekly cash drops to envelopes with initials instead of names. Defense attorneys fought each piece. Judges issued rulings on search law. Reporters took down quotes each time he left a courtroom, because he still couldn't resist a line to lighten the mood. To a room full of cameras, he said he was a businessman, not a bandit, and that he liked the ponies same as half the crowd at any track. That framing, which had worked for years, found less sympathy among officials determined to show the public they were serious after televised revelations. The family across the river was also shifting. Frank Costello remained the face of a leadership group that prided itself on influence rather than spectacle. But pressure from Vito Genovese's faction had not disappeared. Joe Adonis, his friend and sometime partner in New Jersey, faced immigration trouble and federal attention that made every meeting more complicated. The idea that North Jersey could skate by while New York roiled was fantasy. Every change in Manhattan rippled through Bergen and Hudson. In that climate, a capo who drew cameras like a headliner brought trouble no one wanted. Conversations about asking him to retire or take a long trip were described as protective. He heard them as insults. He had spent decades being useful. The idea of stepping aside felt like surrender. Meanwhile, the race wire remained essential and contested. After the Annenberg Empire unraveled, other operators pushed their services, promising faster results and better protection. Local bookmaking outfits wanted the best feed, but Willie's structure required discipline. No freelancing deals, no plugging into a wire without authorization, no undercutting lines to steal another room's clients. When someone broke those rules, he held a sit-down and laid out consequences in even tones. The first response was always a warning. The aim was to avoid public shows of force that would end up in headlines. He repeated this practice endlessly, calming hot tempers and reminding ambitious younger men that short-term grabs often led to long-term ruin. That approach had built his local peace. It was now being tested by a national media moment that made discretion harder. The summer and early fall of 1951 turned into a tightrope. He wanted to show that nothing had changed. He walked into familiar restaurants at midday, took a booth or a table where he could see the room, and greeted regulars by name. He made sure envelopes reached the right desks, that clerks arrested in sweeps had counsel, and that clubs paid union crews properly so stagehands didn't become a new source of friction. He also tried to reassure nervous allies that his hearing appearance had not betrayed anyone. He insisted he had answered politely without giving up specifics, a distinction he believed mattered. For men who measure risk by silence alone, it did not. On an October afternoon, the balance ended. He sat down to lunch at a neighborhood place in Cliffside Park, a spot where he felt as safe as he ever did in public. It was the kind of room where waiters knew his usual order and patrons greeted him with the relaxed nods owed to someone familiar. Midday crowds came and went. Conversations rose and fell in the way of cafes that straddle ordinary life and underworld rituals. Visitors entered who did not come for the menu. Shots were fired. The sudden noise turned chatter into panic. In moments, it was over. He was left at the table, never to rise again. The men who carried out the attack vanished as quickly as they had arrived. Police sealed off the scene and took statements. The press gathered outside, as they always did when a man everyone knew but no one officially acknowledged became a headline. The initial accounts described the killing as abrupt and precise. Detectives canvassed the area, spoke with workers and customers, and compared notes with investigators who had spent months tracking him for gambling. A case file formed, thick with speculation and thin on firm leads. The motive hardly needed elaboration. In that world, a talkative figure fighting multiple indictments, while struggling with a deteriorating mind, posed a risk to too many. The consensus, widely shared among law enforcement and journalists, held that people he once called allies had decided to end the risk. Courts never produced a conviction. The killing joined a long list of unsolved underworld murders that marked transitions of power far better than any press release could. Reaction traveled in waves. Ordinary patrons who liked him for his jokes and generosity shook their heads at the news and went home to tell families that the man from the pictures on television had been killed at lunch. Nightclub owners whispered about what this meant for bookings and settlements. Politicians who had accepted campaign support quietly checked their files. In the underworld, the message was clear. Televised charisma did not outweigh the old code, and health that made a man unpredictable would not be tolerated for long. Within days, people who had worked under his supervision were meeting with new handlers. Collections proceeded on schedule. Rooms opened under the same names but with different people behind the phone. The aftermath touched show business too. Entertainers who had relied on his phone calls found other routes to bookings. The Riviera kept operating, Managers who had learned to count on his word adapted, because clubs cannot sit dark for long. The Sinatra legend, already a fixture in gossip, took on a melancholy hue when columnists recounted that a man often credited rightly or wrongly with smoothing an early contract for a singer he liked had died in a way that the industry pretended not to understand. Sinatra, careful about public comments, kept distance from those narratives. The myths around that story grew over the years precisely because he was gone and could no longer joke them away or correct them. Family handled arrangements with a privacy he had rarely enjoyed in life. Friends from both legitimate and gray zones paid respects. Reporters stood at a distance, noting the names they could identify and scribbling descriptions when they could not. He was laid to rest in New Jersey soil, not far from the streets where he had built his career. The funeral did not change the public record that described him as a gambler and a racketeer. It revealed something else about his life, the odd blend of affection and fear he had cultivated. Distant cousins, former waiters and bartenders who owed him steady shifts, stood near men whose titles never appeared on business cards. The scene was quiet, respectful, and in its own way emblematic of the life he had led. The public and the private, the legal and the illicit, standing side by side, pretending the line between them was clear. For law enforcement, the killing was both a setback and a prompt. A dead witness answers no more questions. At the same time, a headline like that fed public demands to continue reform. Committees in state houses kept probing. Prosecutors emphasized conspiracy counts to sweep up more actors at once. Agencies leaned harder on tax cases that had sent other big names to prison. In New Jersey, attention drifted toward figures who had been less visible while he drew the light. The rackets adjusted, because demand for gambling didn't fade with a single death. Bookmaking moved forward under new managers. The numbers continued to run. Machines disappeared from a few places and reappeared in others. The wire service remained the lifeblood, parceled out under fresh agreements with the same old conditions. Pay on time, keep quiet, and don't bring heat. Inside the syndicate associated with the family across the river, New Jersey management reconfigured. Experienced hands with a much lower profile took on roles he once filled. Men like Gerardo Catena, who long preferred caution to applause, became more prominent in the state, while Newark's old guard under leaders such as Longy's Willman continued on their own track until their time came. Those shifts didn't erase his influence. For years, his approach personal relationships over spectacle, steady order instead of open warfare, had kept violence out of headlines and money flowing. His killing, carried out without public theatrics, reflected the same emphasis on keeping neighborhoods calm, even when removing a high-profile figure. The steadying hand he had provided was replaced not by chaos but by a quieter set of managers who had learned from his success and his mistakes. Looking back across his life from that moment, the ledger of acts that broke the law is plain. He made his name in prohibition by helping move liquor and protect speakeasies. He built a fortune on illegal gambling bookmaking on the ponies, the neighborhood numbers, card and dice games behind cafe doors. He placed and profited from slot machines and amusements skirted around local statutes. He arranged political protection with donations and favors, a loop of influence that kept doors open and inspections predictable. He controlled access to the race wire and enforced rules that kept his region stable. He extended credit at rates designed to profit from risk. He used reputation, the threat of exclusion, and the occasional stern meeting to keep order so that violence rarely spilled into public view. He cultivated entertainers and clubs because crowded rooms translated into envelopes worth counting. He faced charges for many of those acts, beat some, paid fines on others, and walked out of courtrooms with jokes that sounded like victory until the day they didn't. He was not a mastermind in a penthouse drawing charts. He was a connector with a knack for making people feel at ease even while he steered them toward his preferred outcome. That talent made him effective and memorable. It also made him vulnerable in a new era where cameras turned charm into a liability and illness made control slip. The end at a lunch table in a suburban restaurant was grim for a man who had avoided public violence for decades. It sent a lesson through a network that did not rely on lessons written down. The lesson was simple. The rules hadn't changed just because television had arrived. Silence still mattered more than smiles. In the months that followed, neighborhoods adjusted to the absence of the man everyone had known. Bettors kept betting, clubs kept booking, Police continued to raid the same addresses under new names. Politicians promised better enforcement. The overall shape of the world he had helped build stayed in place while names on envelopes changed. His story, retold in newspapers and in the whispered histories that passed through bars and back rooms, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of visibility, the cruelty of unchecked illness, and the limits of personality in a trade that values nothing so much as discretion. He left behind a map of neighborhoods that still moved to his rhythm. To understand what those places lost, it helps to trace how he'd stitched them together in the first place, and why his absence didn't unravel the entire fabric. In North Jersey, illegal gambling had long been a local craft. Small rooms, familiar faces, cash carried in pockets rather than briefcases. He turned that craft into a coordinated trade. The method wasn't mysterious. It relied on reliable payoffs, clear boundaries, and the race wire's heartbeat. When a bookmaker took too much action on a single horse, he could lay off part of the risk to another room so the odds didn't sink him. That exchange depended on trust. He built that trust by paying on time and enforcing rules when someone tried to duck a debt. The same logic applied to the numbers game. Writers collected slips door to door, and a banker, not the kind with a marble lobby, kept the books, paid winners, and made sure totals matched the published figure that determined the day's winning digits. Using public figures from racetrack handle or bond drawings limited cheating. That bit of fairness kept customers coming back. He hadn't invented those mechanics. He standardized them in his corner of the state and wrapped them in an attitude that made even reluctant partners feel at ease. A tavern owner might balk at a slot machine tucked beside the cigarette vending box. A conversation with him and a reminder of how slow Tuesday nights could be often melted resistance. Machines brought steady coin, but they also brought attention. To limit that, he rotated placements, kept the most obvious units out of sight, and set collection schedules that didn't coincide with predictable inspection days. When raids came, he made sure the owner had counsel, the machine could be replaced quietly, and the next week didn't feel like a crisis. His ascent had run in parallel with Frank Costello's rise across the river. After the Castellamarese War ended the old-style street battles in the early 1932, leaders like Luciano and then Costello pushed for a calmer model built on business sense rather than spectacle. Willie fit that culture. He could put money in envelopes, diffuse neighborhood disputes, and charm people who might otherwise resent paying a cut. He understood the politics of it too. In city halls dotted across Bergen and Hudson counties, friendly introductions and support for civic events resulted in fewer surprise visits at closing time. It was corruption, dressed up in civic language, and he played it with a smile that made it feel like community theater. His legal troubles were constant, but rarely catastrophic. Arrests for bookmaking, policy, or possession of gambling devices came with predictable rhythms. He'd be booked, photographed, arraigned, and either fined or set for trial. Defense lawyers challenged warrants, argued that playing numbers was a neighborhood vice rather than organized crime, and painted their client as a gambler, not a gangster. In some years, he seemed to spend as much time in courthouses as he did in clubs. Those appearances fed his public reputation. A man who never looked rattled, who treated a post-arraignment press scrum as if it were another chance to host. The pose threw opponents off balance. It also built resentment inside an environment that prized silence. He liked entertainers because they brought crowds, and crowds washed away tension better than any speech. The Riviera in Fort Lee was his favorite stage to hover near without ever performing. Everyone in that room came to work. Band leaders tuned their sections, comics trimmed their sets, waiters hustled, and the cashier kept an eye on the door. He kept an eye on everything. A clean run of shows meant smooth collections in the back rooms and good feelings at the front of the house. Agents pitched him on a rising crooner or a young comic. He'd listen, offer a date, and then fill the room by calling the same network that handled layoff bets. A full Friday created leverage for Monday's negotiations. That cross-pollination between entertainment and the gambling underlayer was one of his trademarks. His association with Frank Sinatra became a legend while he was alive and only grew after he was gone. People who knew both men said the connection was real, same region, overlapping circles, mutual friends who treated the singer like family. The specific claim that he forced a band leader to release Sinatra from a binding contract was told with different props depending on the storyteller. A threat, a persuasive talk, or a payoff arranged by men in the background. Historians have pointed out the contradictions in those accounts. What can be said without stretching is that he had the kind of leverage in North Jersey night spots that made life easier for a young star, and that the reputation for helping stuck to him because it fit his public persona, a fixer who preferred the soft pressure of a phone call to the hard pressure of a brawl. His portfolio extended beyond card tables and phones. Loans to club owners and bookmakers formed a quiet line on his ledger. If a room had a bad month or a string of winners hit, someone needed cash to cover obligations or to keep a band paid through the weekend. He supplied it at rates that turned risk into profit. Those loans cemented loyalty and gave him a say in operations. Miss a payment once and you got a reminder. Miss twice and you might find your phone silent because his network stopped taking your calls. Again, the emphasis was on order. He'd rather rework terms than cause a scene that made the police curious. The wartime boom years had only intensified those habits. Factories ran late, soldiers brought pay into bars, and tips piled up on Saturdays. He made sure the flow of action kept pace. After the war, he adjusted without drama. New York's internal rivalries, the return of Genovese, Costello's determination to keep influence intact meant that a steady North Jersey earner was valuable. He became, in many accounts, something close to an underboss on the Jersey side for the organization aligned with Costello, a role defined less by title than by utility. He delivered revenue, kept young hotheads from kicking in the wrong door, and made himself useful to men who had power but preferred other people to carry the public risk. That calculus broke under two forces: television and illness. The Kefauver Committee gave the country a ringside seat. He couldn't resist the lights. Viewers saw a man cracking wise about serious topics. Old friends in Manhattan didn't. They saw someone flirting with danger by acknowledging relationships and habits other witnesses refused to admit. Even if he didn't name an address or a date, the performance chipped away at the protective wall their world relied on. At the same time, his mind wasn't doing him favors. People who spent hours with him said he drifted, forgot, returned to a point he'd already made. Doctors used clinical language that, translated, meant he could no longer be trusted with delicate material. In an ordinary family, that verdict would provoke patience and care. In his world, it provoked fear. The day in Cliffside Park ended the debate. News of the lunchroom killing traveled fast. Reporters who had followed his court dates gathered outside the crime scene. Detectives who dogged him for years now investigated a case for which they could not legally name suspects, even if everyone in town had a theory. Coverage was restrained compared to later eras, in part because editors understood the rules. Don't speculate beyond what you can print. The rumor mill didn't need printing. It ran by itself. People said the decision had been made to remove a risk. The method was clinical, the timing chosen to avoid chaos, the message unmistakable. Whatever your charm, whatever your history, the code prevailed. Afterward, the landscape did what it always does. It adjusted. Collections for the numbers continued with new names at the top. Bookmakers called the same wire, settled on the same lines, and sent their layoff bets to different rooms. Machines were switched out or placed under someone else's authority. The Boyardo crew in Newark maintained its long-standing dominance in parts of Essex, overlapping at edges with an older Jewish organization led by Longis Willman. In Bergen and along the Palisades, Gerardo Catena, already influential and instinctively cautious, became more central. Joe Adonis, facing immigration and legal trouble, edged out of the picture over the next few years, eventually leaving the country under pressure. Across the river, Costello would be wounded in a later attempt on his life and drift toward retirement, while Genovese's push for the top and the debacle at Appalachian defined the next phase. His death fit into that broader movement of chairs at a table that never stayed the same for long. What didn't change was how ordinary people encountered the racket. Bets were still placed with a guy they trusted. A cop still warned a tavern owner if a raid was scheduled for show. Clubs still needed a draw on Friday nights. The system he'd tended was built to survive personnel shifts. That was its design. He had codified behavior. Pay winners promptly, don't carry public grudges, avoid scenes in front of churches and schools, contribute to the parish supper and the police athletic league, and keep everyone who mattered feeling respected. Even in his absence, men he'd mentored kept those habits because they worked. Looking back over his ledger, the list of offenses is straightforward. Smuggling liquor during Prohibition, running bookmaking operations on thoroughbreds, harness races, and sports as the markets evolved, supervising the numbers game, placing and profiting from illegal machines, arranging protection and payoffs that corrupted local officials, controlling access to the race wire, and extending high-interest loans that kept shaky rooms open and indebted to him. He did not shy from any of it. When cornered by a reporter who wanted to know whether he regretted choices, he'd deflect with a line about providing services people clearly wanted. That answer dodged the broader harm, the way corruption erodes public trust, and the way easy money reshapes neighborhoods. But it reflected how he viewed the world. As a set of transactions he knew how to manage. There's a temptation to turn him into a metaphor, the last of the old-time racketeers who liked a joke and hated noise. He wasn't the last. He was one in a line, defined by the era's technologies and appetites. The wire service made his model possible at scale. Television helped end his career by making secrecy harder to maintain. His particular version of the job rested on personality, a risky bet in a profession that punishes loose talk. Yet those same social gifts made him effective for years. A room cooled down when he walked in. A deputy mayor who might ignore another man's request took his call because the favors had flowed both ways at holiday time. People who worked under him remembered two things: the way he could remember details about their families, and the way he could recite numbers from the previous week's take without looking at a page. That dual memory, names and figures, was part of his authority. You could not bluff him about why a drop was light, because he'd recall that you'd had a run of bad weather, or that a rival had opened a loud poker room around the corner. He could also put a hand on your shoulder and ask after your mother's health, and you'd believe he meant it. In a world where fear is the usual glue, he used attention as glue. It kept people in line because they didn't want to disappoint him, and because they knew he noticed when someone tried to cut a side deal. Critics sometimes ask why communities tolerated figures like him. The answer lies in the blurred line between service and exploitation. Betting appealed to millions. Clubs kept people employed. Envelopes for school teams and parades softened judgments. The costs, payoffs that neutered law enforcement, debts that crushed small operators, decisions made in back rooms rather than open council chambers were real but easier to ignore when the city felt festive and the sidewalks stayed safe. He counted on that preference for comfort over principle. It made his hustle possible. It also made his exit feel, to many, like a loss of a certain kind of order, even if the order itself was illegal. In the official record, his name appears in court calendars, committee transcripts, arrest logs, and a scattering of property records tied to homes and quiet investments. In culture, it shows up in memoirs and biographies, especially in the chapters about the early days of famous performers who played the clubs he favored. The Sinatra story lives on because it sits at the crossroads of two American obsessions: stardom and the underworld. Whether he actually forced a signature or merely applied pressure, his presence in that narrative gives it weight. It also illustrates how his reach extended beyond gambling into the broader entertainment economy, where a well-placed phone call could change a career. If there is a lesson in his life for anyone not interested in crime stories as such, it's about the risk of mistaking charm for safety. He survived as long as he did because he smoothed rough edges between police and clubs, between rival crews, between owners and entertainers. That smoothing helped people. It also masked harm. When the mask slipped on television, under pressure from illness, the men who depended on secrecy to protect their revenue and freedom acted to protect themselves. The act was quick, the fallout measured, the machine uninterrupted. He had always believed that a well-timed laugh could carry him past trouble. In the end, laughter could not change the rulebook he had followed and enforced for decades. Years after he was gone, older patrons in North Jersey still told stories about the days when a man in a light suit and a carnation could turn a slow Wednesday into a busy Friday with 2 phone calls. Former runners remembered the long mornings of door-to-door numbers pickups and the careful ritual of counting in apartments that faced back alleys. Club musicians recalled envelopes waiting at the end of the week, counted out to the dollar. Detectives who had chased him admitted, grudgingly, that he was polite even when he knew I wouldn't find anything that would stick. Those memories form the oral history that runs alongside the official one. Together they sketch a life lived in plain sight between the law and the limelight. A life that made a part of New Jersey hum, and then went suddenly quiet at a lunch table leaving behind a template others would follow, and a cautionary tale that still gets told whenever a smiling face decides to test the limits of a secret world. His name lingered in the air long after the last headline faded. Taxi drivers told passengers that he used to sit right there at the corner table in Fort Lee. Old bartenders pointed to a wall where a framed photo once hung and said a smile like his could quiet a noisy room. People who had placed a small bet on payday swore that their runner treated them more fairly when he was in charge. In New Jersey lore, he became a human landmark, tied to a stretch of riverfront clubs and hillside towns where neon washed the sidewalks on weekends. Memory softened the edges, but the core remained. He had organized illegal gambling with uncommon poise, brokered influence without bragging, and moved between worlds that rarely mixed. The parts that mattered to history were not the jokes he told, but the stubborn shape of the economy he helped perfect. The way cash moved, the way a phone call could redirect a crowd, the way an envelope changed the temperature at City Hall. Reformers tried to smother that economy with new tools. Congress targeted the hardware and the money paths that kept it alive. A federal law passed in 1951 restricted shipping gambling devices across state lines, unless the destination allowed them, a direct strike at the slot trade that had hopped boroughs and rivers for years. The same period brought a new federal tax on wagers and a stamp requirement intended to force bookmakers into the open. That tax gave prosecutors leverage, because failing to register and pay became a separate offense. For a while, those measures shook rooms where phones once rang freely. Some operators tried to launder action through coded ledgers to dodge both cops and tax collectors. Others shut down briefly, replaced a sign on the door, and carried on under new arrangements. The demand never went away. You could make it awkward to run a book, but you couldn't pry the habit out of neighborhoods that had treated a small bet as a routine part of adult life. The information pipeline faced pressure too. Private services that fed race results and odds to back rooms drew scrutiny for their role in knitting local games into a national business. Investigators leaned on landlords, utility companies, and phone technicians to identify rooms whose only customers were teletypes and men with pencil stubs behind their ears. In response, operators broke up big hubs and moved equipment more often. The cat and mouse game didn't end with a single law. It became a permanent feature of the landscape. In that adaptation, you could see the bones of the structure he had nurtured. Keep things small. Keep schedules flexible. Move, if you must. Avoid spectacles. Take losses quietly. Build trust in a circle so tight that an outsider couldn't tell who gave orders. Show business shifted at the same time. The big band era waned, small combos rose, and television siphoned audiences from supper clubs. The Riviera, once the brightest perch on the Jersey Palisades, suffered fires and finally slipped into history, taking with it a certain kind of glamorous night that had defined the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds along that cliff. Fort Lee's brief moment as a showplace gave way to a quieter town, its flashlight beams along the Hudson replaced by TV glow in living rooms. Those who remembered the Riviera at its peak talked about a room so alive it felt like a movie set, about the way his presence eased quarrels before they started, about the precision with which deals were made in the lobby between a chorus number and a comic's closer. That interlock clubs feeding gambling feeding clubs never vanished entirely, but it lost the sheen he'd burnished. With him gone, the system kept running, but the show lost a charismatic MC. Myths cemented while facts scattered. The Sinatra story, already a campfire favorite, settled into public imagination as the origin tale of a star. In the most dramatic retelling, a bandleader agreed to release a young singer for a token sum after a pointed visit. Other versions emphasized money and negotiation rather than menace. Researchers later sifted contracts, interviews, and legal filings, and found contradictions they couldn't resolve. What stayed true was proximity. A Hoboken singer and a North Jersey fixer moved in the same orbit, and the fixer had the clout to make life easier. Pop culture took that seed and planted it in novels and films, where a crooner with a velvet voice receives career freedom after an offer no one refuses. The character on the page wasn't him by name, but the echo was unmistakable. It tells you something about his footprint that a rumor about his influence helped mint one of America's enduring screen legends. Power in North Jersey rebalanced after his exit. Quiet figures rose. Gerardo Catina, long a byword for caution, tightened control of the counties, where cash flowed steadily. Newark's lines remained tangled, with old alliances in the Jewish mob fading as leaders aged or died, and Italian crews under long-established bosses filled gaps. In the broader organization tied to Manhattan, the years ahead brought more upheaval. A brazen shot at Frank Costello in 1957, a summit in upstate New York that turned into a debacle later that fall, and a narcotics case that toppled Vito Genovese soon after. Those events did not erase his footprint. They showed how volatile the top had become, and why men like him, operators who pacified edges and kept revenue steady, had been valuable. In quieter memoirs and interviews, veterans of that world admitted that the peace he kept in Bergen and along the Palisades had saved everyone money by preventing public wars. Community memory clung to the soft edges. Parish fundraisers remembered checks arriving without fanfare. Youth teams wore uniforms purchased with anonymous cash. After severe weather, certain blocks saw deliveries paid for by unseen hands. People who benefited from those gestures tend to tell kinder stories later. That generosity was never separate from the business. It bought time, muffled complaints, and produced a protective layer of goodwill when a raid landed or an indictment made the paper. A cop who believed the man behind the money kept a rough order might warn a tavern twice before writing a summons. A council member might argue against a noisy cleanup that threatened a dozen jobs at a club everyone liked. Those pragmatic decisions, repeated across years, help explain how his system survived so long in plain sight. There were also the human fragments, the pieces that never make it into ledgers or case files but surface through memory. A trumpet player recalled that he never let a band go unpaid, even if the crowd was thin. A stagehand said the loading dock ran smoother when he dropped by. A cab driver swore that after a late show, the man tipped double and told him to get home safe. Runners from the numbers route remembered very early mornings and the ritual of counting in a room with blinds half closed. A lawyer who handled countless arraignments said his client faced each charge as if he were attending a routine meeting and not a criminal hearing. None of those details change the record of criminal acts. They describe a manner that made the record possible. A talent for making illegal commerce feel like ordinary life. Even after federal attention rose, the nuts and bolts of his trade stayed stubborn. The numbers still relied on public figures to set the winning sequence, precisely because those figures could not be faked without notice. Bookmakers still hedged risk by laying off part of heavy bets. Enforcers still tried to fix disputes privately, because public discipline invited cameras. Money still moved up, a cut still moved down, and someone at the top still fielded the hardest calls, the ones where a mistake could drag a neighborhood into chaos. He had played that top role for years. People who stepped into it after him copied his house rules: pay promptly, avoid threats in front of civilians, keep meetings short, pick up the phone when a politician calls, and in doing so, they kept his spirit alive, even while avoiding his mistakes. Law enforcement adapted as well. County crackdowns shifted from periodic sweeps to broader conspiracy cases that tried to capture how the network functioned rather than just what was on the table in one room. Tax investigators used ledgers and sudden changes in lifestyle to make cases when direct testimony was scarce. Later, when national statutes tightened the noose around interstate betting communications, the wire that had once given small rooms instant access to results became riskier to use. Decades after his death, court decisions would prune some tools back, but the ebb and flow of authority never ended. Cops, prosecutors, and agents studied older cases. His included to understand why narrow charges failed, and how to build wider ones that matched the real shape of gambling economies. Stories about his family life remained mostly private, not because reporters lacked interest, but because the circle around him kept that space tight. That choice was deliberate from early on. He never paraded relatives in club lobbies, never turned personal milestones into shows, and discouraged friends from mixing home with business. Of course, famous faces showed up at big gatherings. His world overlapped with entertainment more than most. Newspaper columns noted surprise guests and bursts of applause at receptions. The lesson he tried to teach younger men was simple: keep invitations limited when you can, because the more people see, the more they think they know. He followed that guideline himself until the very end, when a simple lunch at a neighborhood place ended the story without a curtain call. As the years passed, his image split in two. In one version, he was the genial gambler who, like singers, and helped keep the peace in New Jersey's clubs. In the other, he was a durable cog in a machine that relied on corruption, coercion by reputation, and avoidance of accountability. Both are true. He could make a fundraiser sparkle while also collecting on debts that came with serious pressure. He could charm a city desk while also setting boundaries for bookmakers who forgot who controlled the phones. He could ease a conversation at a courthouse door and then step into a back room to settle a dispute with firmness no one doubted. Holding those truths together is the only way to understand him. To reduce him to a punchline or a monster is to ignore how he operated and why he lasted as long as he did. What endures is a set of choices. He chose to make a living in rackets, first liquor, when the Constitution said no, then gambling after repeal made alcohol legal again. He chose to manage politics through favors rather than risk fair fights in open forums. He chose to invest in clubs and performers because he saw that the entertainment economy fueled everything else he ran. He chose to speak lightly to officials when silence would have served him better, a flaw sharpened by illness that clouded judgment. He chose visibility in an age that began rewarding invisibility. Those choices created a career and then shortened it. They also left a map of North Jersey where, for years, the line separating legal nightlife from illegal betting was a doorway only a handful of people truly controlled. A final measure of his legacy sits in the way later generations talked about the 1,940 seconds and early 1,950 seconds. People said neighborhoods felt safer then, not because crime was absent, but because someone made sure trouble stayed out of sight. It is a seductive memory, comfort wrapped around complicity. The order he prized depended on silencing complaints, buying influence, and normalizing lawbreaking that diverted public trust into private profit. He would have answered that pointed critique with a shrug and a quip about giving people what they wanted. History gives the more complete reply. Services delivered by men who stand outside the law come with costs communities eventually have to pay. When the bills arrived in probes, in scandals, in reforms, his name sat near the top of the stack as both symbol and cause. Even now, when you read the old clippings or listen to taped hearings, his voice still surprises. It's not the tone you expect from a man in that position. It disarms you for a second. That was his gift, and his undoing. He made people like him, and for a long time that liking greased a machine that turned vices into revenue without constant explosions. In a different calling, those instincts might have built a life in politics or show business proper. In the one he chose, they bought him time and finally ran out. His story remains a lesson in how personality can hide structure, how a friendly face can mask a hard set of rules, and how, in a place like North Jersey between the river and the hills, one person's knack for keeping things smooth can shape a whole region's nights until the lights go up and the room is empty. Years later, when researchers and reporters tried to stitch together a complete picture from court files, transcripts, and fading clippings, they found a life that made sense only when you kept two truths in mind at once. He was a neighborly presence who shook hands in diners and told jokes to calm a tense room. He was also a long-running manager of illegal markets that thrived because people looked away when the price of looking closely felt high. Both pieces matter. If you only saw the smile, you missed the structure. If you only saw the structure, you missed why it worked for so long in towns where everyone knew someone who placed a small wager on payday. The paper trail shows how early he learned the rhythm of that world. Young, newly American, and hungry for a way to send money home, he carried slips for bookmakers, learned to read the horse pages with the same care. Other men read stock quotes and discovered how much leverage sat in the seconds between a result at a track and the moment it reached a phone in a bar. Petty collars for gaming drifted through precinct blotters. Nothing spectacular, nothing that looked like a future underworld post. He was learning a craft routes, courtesies, who to greet by first name, who to avoid entirely. Those lessons paid when Prohibition flipped nightlife upside down. The liquor ban taught him logistics. Trucks had to meet boats without fanfare. Cases had to land behind doors that stayed closed to the wrong knock. Bartenders needed protection from smash-and-grab artists who mistook a quiet speakeasy for an easy score. He played fixer in that maze, a role built less on bravado than on lists, timing, and money counted in a back room. The end of the ban didn't end his career. It gave him a cleaner surface to stand on while he shifted the same skills to other markets. Gambling made the most sense. Bookmaking knit together the whole region, from lunch counters in Hoboken to taverns in Bergenfield. The numbers game provided a neighborhood lottery that regulars could understand without a manual. Machines filled the dead corners of bars that needed something to keep patrons in their seats between innings and songs. None of it worked without the wire. Race results and odds fed down from national services into narrow offices that existed for no other purpose, and those figures allowed a bookmaker to balance risk across a web he coordinated. If a bet pile got too heavy on a single horse, part of that exposure moved to another room, then another, until no one shop got crushed. That required trust and rules. He supplied both. Rules were simple and enforced with care. Pay winners promptly, no freelancing on someone else's street, don't make a scene near churches or schools, don't double-cross a layoff partner, don't stiff your own runner, and keep your mouth shut when the law shows up. The last rule always mattered, but never more than after he turned into a television personality for one strange week. For years, though, this code kept Bergen and the Palisades calm compared to louder cities. If a club drew complaints, he shifted a game 2 blocks. If a rival opened too close, he arranged a sit-down, not a spectacle. If a patrol captain needed a gentle reminder to schedule a visit after closing, a contribution found its way into a civic fundraiser with an extra napkin over the envelope. That blend of management, soft pressure, and civic polish made his version of racketeering feel, to many who benefited, like ordinary life. He shared space with other long-established figures. In Newark, Longy Zwillman ran an empire that outlasted Prohibition and kept its grip by making peace where practical and pushing back when pressed. In Bergen and Hudson, he stood as the New Jersey extension of the Manhattan family then associated with Luciano and later Costello, a cousin in both blood and business, who delivered steady revenue and avoided street drama most days. Joe Adonis strode through the same counties with flash and bravado, a friend and ally who understood how to draw a crowd without blowing up the room. Those relationships worked because each man knew where to tread lightly and where to plant both feet. Court calendars mark the tempo of his life in the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds. Arrested for bookmaking here, questioned after a machine sweep there, implicated in lottery operations in yet another county. Judges saw the same defense lawyers, heard similar arguments about overbroad searches and sloppy warrants, and set fines that read like the price of doing business. The cases mattered less than the rhythm they created. Periods of quiet punctuated by clumps of arraignments, and a photo on the courthouse steps. He used those appearances to cultivate the persona that disarmed so many. Reporters left with usable quotes. Opponents left annoyed that he could turn a scolding into a smile. The Riviera made that persona shine. Ben Martin built it, rings of tables and a big stage overlooking the river. A glamorous room that became a calling card for North Jersey nightlife. He worked it like a second home. Agents tried to sell him on a soprano with a clean high note. Comics asked for the late show. Bandstands flashed under white lights, while deals flavored the air in the lobby and bar. If a manager needed a weekend to be full, he knew whom to call. If a singer's contract created a problem, he had ideas about how to solve it. That is the atmosphere in which the Sinatra legend grew, a rumor rooted in real proximity. A young singer wanted freedom from a bandleader. A North Jersey fixer was said to have made it happen. In one telling, a signature followed a tense meeting. In another, money and persuasion did the work. Writers and biographers chased the truth through decades of retellings and never settled it completely. What stayed solid was the connection and the clout that came with filling a room on command. He did more than book acts and make rooms hum. Loans bridged slow weeks for club owners and saved books that had paid out too many winners. Collections from machines were timed to dodge scheduled inspections. Police comfort was purchased with donations dressed up as community spirit. The wire was policed by him as much as by any national operator, because he decided who in his orbit could plug in and who had to wait. He preferred to keep discipline private. The threat that mattered most in his world wasn't a shout. It was a pause, no more access to results. No layoff partners taking your calls. No cushion when a bad run hit. That kind of pressure kept order without inviting headlines. Television shifted that balance. The Keefe-over hearings, choreographed for a country curious about hidden networks, handed him a stage. He leaned into it. Smiles, wisecracks, polite acknowledgments of a life spent in that line. and a careful refusal to nail himself to a specific date or ledger. Viewers loved the character sketch. Old friends in Manhattan cringed. Even if he revealed nothing that would hold up in court, he showed ease with an act the old code demanded you hide. Files thickened in county offices. Federal agents paid fresh visits. He issued the same reassurances he always had. That he was a gambler, not a menace. That neighborhood betting did not equal some exotic conspiracy. That argument had worked for years because millions of Americans loved a day at the track and saw no villain in someone who took a bet without waving a gun. The medium had changed, though, and with it the political appetite for tolerance. The strain of illness made everything worse. Friends watched him repeat stories and lose threads. Doctors used cautious terms that translated into a simple verdict in an environment that punished loose talk. He could no longer be trusted to keep secrets safely. Protection from above started to fray. Meetings he once ran were handed to others. Advice he once gave with authority now drew nervous looks. He relied on instinct, the same instinct that had carried him through 100 tense rooms. Grace, bonhomie, a laugh to melt ice. It wasn't enough. His death at a lunch table in Cliffside Park closed the ledger in a way that matched the rules he had enforced for years. Quick, clinical, no public theater, no aftermath that would bring sirens to a dozen doors. Police opened a case they never closed. The underworld absorbed the lesson and moved on. Collectors changed routes by a few blocks. Bookmakers kept the same numbers and settled with the same handshakes under different names. The Riviera kept booking until fires and changing tastes closed that chapter. Envelopes still found their way into civic hands that claimed innocence. People shook their heads and said the old days were gone, by which they meant the days when a familiar face kept things smooth. Cultural echoes carried his name even where the facts grew thin. A famous novel used a storyline about a crooner freed from a bad contract to underline the power of its crime family, a clear nod to the rumor that linked a Hoboken singer with a New Jersey fixer. Films borrowed the feel of rooms he used to command the tuxedos, the smiles, the deals carried by a glance across a crowd. Journalists wrote profiles of Frank Costello and Vito Genovese that inevitably paused to note the cousin in New Jersey who made money without noise until one day the noise found him. None of that pop history should be mistaken for proof. It does show how deep his footprint sank into the culture that retold those years. On the ground, the structure he built proved durable because it was modular. Writers for the numbers could be replaced without breaking the bank that paid winners. Phone rooms could shift one floor or one block and still catch the same calls that always came at 10 to post time. Machine routes could reroute around a new sergeant who wanted a showy press conference. The big rule "don't bring heat" stayed useful. He had used smiles to enforce it. Men who followed used fewer smiles and more silence. The result looked the same to the public. Weekend crowds, morning pickups, whispered warnings. A city that seemed calm because the most disruptive problems were solved out of sight. The list of crimes tied to his career reads the same no matter how you shuffle it: illegal liquor in the 1,920 seconds, bookmaking on the ponies, and later on sports, as opportunities opened, policy banks, slot machines and their cousins dressed up as trade stimulators, corrupt payments to public officials, control over a wire service that made local gambling part of a national market, and interest rates on loans that kept struggling operators dependent. He faced charges related to many of those activities. Some cases ended in modest penalties. Others collapsed midstream. None brought a long prison stretch. That outcome wasn't an accident. It reflected the way juries saw gambling at mid-century, the gaps in statutes before lawmakers modernized them, and the social cover he cultivated by making himself useful to clubs, politicians, and even the police. He didn't hide from the civic side of his life. Charity dinners saw him at a table near the dais. Church raffles and police athletic leagues received checks. During winters, deliveries showed up on blocks where heat bills ran high. Beneficiaries remembered the good deed and ignored the ledger it served. That was the exchange he counted on. Communities got help that felt neighborly. He got time and quiet. When reformers came with new laws, taxes on bets, restrictions on shipping gambling devices, a growing willingness to pursue conspiracy rather than a single back room, those habits of goodwill made it harder for some voters to cheer a crackdown. That tension explains why enforcement after the televised hearings brought mixed results. Politicians wanted credit. Residents wanted their Friday entertainment. He had navigated that divide for years by keeping his version of order. After he was gone, the divide remained. Only the names on envelopes changed. Even his critics conceded that he imposed a kind of civic etiquette on a business that could have turned nasty nightly. No fights in front of families, no threats in public, no humiliating a debtor in a way that drew bystanders. Keep your dress sharp, your voice low, your bills paid. That code seems quaint next to later eras when headlines grew darker, but it grew out of the realities of his time. A racket that blended with ordinary nightlife needed to avoid ruptures that put off paying customers or forced politicians to be seen taking sides. His smooth approach reduced friction. It didn't make the underlying acts harmless. It made them tolerable enough that the town kept moving. What remains, after you strip away the glamour and the punchlines, is a sober lesson about how vice markets entangle themselves with daily life. They survive by becoming boring, by turning extraordinary risk into routines that feel like housekeeping. He excelled at that transformation. He made gambling seem like a service with rules, consequences, and customer relations. The men who inherited his lanes in North Jersey kept that service running. They adopted his quiet rules and dropped his habit of playing to the crowd. In doing so, they honored the part of his legacy that protected revenue and discarded the part that had finally cost him everything. Time has a way of polishing rough edges until only the outline remains, but the paperwork never quite disappears. In folders tucked away in county archives and federal record rooms, you can trace a life that ran on cash, courtesy, and calculation. Early notices list minor gaming counts. Later, as his reach grew, the charges carried bigger names: conspiracy to run bookmaking, maintaining a gambling resort, possession of devices, income questions that suggested the government suspected a mismatch between lifestyle and declared earnings. He answered each summons the same way: present, composed, and ready with a quip that turned a line of reporters into an audience. That manner didn't change what the papers alleged. He had built and sustained an illegal economy across towns that treated betting as habit, and he did it while cultivating a reputation that made enforcement harder and consent easier. The runway into that economy began with immigration and neighborhood survival. Families crowded into walk-ups near the river, where storekeepers extended credit, and children learned English in bursts between chores. He found his niche where raw hustle met quiet rules. Carrying slips for bookmakers taught him how information outruns law when a margin of minutes turns into money. Running errands for bootleggers during Prohibition taught him how to shield logistics with manners, how to make a delivery feel like a favor, and how to keep tempers from lighting up rooms that couldn't afford attention. When repeal arrived, he repurposed those lessons. The product changed. The method endured. That method revolved around the wire. The network that carried racing results and odds was the nervous system of mid-century gambling. Access meant survival. Exclusion meant ruin. He acted as gatekeeper in his region, deciding who could plug in, enforcing standards about timing, payouts, and layoff practices, and ensuring that one reckless player didn't sink a circuit of small rooms. He wasn't alone in that role. National services supplied the data, and bosses from other cities did the same work in their neighborhoods. His contribution was a set of local rules that emphasized fast payment, predictable behavior, and an aversion to spectacle. Those rules were not altruistic. They protected revenue by avoiding the kind of public disorder that brought mayors and cameras to your door. The income streams themselves were familiar to anyone who knew North Jersey nights between the wars and into the 1,950 seconds. Bookmaking on thoroughbreds and harness races kept phones ringing from lunch through late afternoon. The numbers game turned 3 digits into a payday for the lucky and a steady take for the bank. Machines, renamed and repainted to skate under ordinances, clicked in taverns that preferred coin counting to quiet rooms. Cards and dice appeared behind doors that a host opened only after you said the right name. Loans filled gaps when a bookmaker had a bad week or a club owner needed to keep a band paid. The glue holding all of that together was influence over cops who scheduled inspections, over politicians who accepted help with fundraisers, over entertainers and agents who knew which rooms mattered. His alliance with Frank Costello and friendship with Joe Adonis placed him inside a power structure that valued order over drama. Within that framework, he served as North Jersey's point man, The person who could take a call from Manhattan and make a decision stick from Hoboken to Hackensack without noise. The Newark axis first under Longines Willman, and later with Italian bosses whose roots ran deep in Essex County interlocked with his lanes at the edges. It wasn't a neat map. It was a living arrangement negotiated daily through favors, boundaries, and the occasional sit-down. He excelled at that negotiation because he brought warmth into rooms where others brought volume. Show business was more than a sideline. It was his public stage. At the Riviera, Ben Marden's jewel overlooking the river, he held court without ever touching a microphone. Tables filled when he called. Disputes over billing or splits found a solution when he leaned in with a joke and a plan. That is the environment where the Sinatra story took root and spread. Accounts differ in detail. Some say a tense meeting freed a singer from a bandleader's grip. Others describe money and phone calls doing the work. What nobody disputes is proximity and capacity. He had the reach to make a week easy or hard for an act, and the reputation for smoothing paths for performers he liked. That aura followed him into newspapers and, eventually, onto television. Television created the pivot point. The Kefauver hearings turned hidden power into daytime drama. He appeared, smiled, and treated a Senate panel like a room he could host. He acknowledged knowing the names everyone already knew, framed himself as a gambler among gamblers, and ducked details that could tie him to a specific ledger. The viewing public found him disarming. Law enforcement found him infuriating. Allies found him alarming. The old code said you do not perform when the government calls your name. He performed, even if he revealed little that prosecutors could use. The ease itself looked like betrayal to men who measured loyalty by silence, not charm. Health made that miscalculation worse. Friends had noticed him repeating stories, losing track, cracking jokes where discretion would have done. Doctors quietly warned of deterioration that, in that era, often stemmed from an untreated infection with grave neurological effects. In a business where memory and restraint are currency, a man who could not always marshal both at once became a risk. Protective hands tried to move him aside, to give him a graceful exit. Pride and habit pushed him back into the rooms that had always rewarded his presence. He kept going to lunch, kept dropping by clubs, kept making himself visible in a period when invisibility had become a survival skill. The end arrived in a moment that reflected the very rules he had enforced. Quick, contained, without spectacle. Detectives gathered statements and opened a file that would outlast the patience of the public. No court ever closed the circle with a conviction. The logic embedded in the case was plain. A high-ranking operator, tied by blood and business to the leadership in Manhattan, had become dangerously loose under pressure. Removal preserved the quiet that money needed. It was a brutal decision packaged, as always in that world, as routine maintenance. Afterward, the system he'd tended did not collapse. It settled. Gerardo Catena and other low-visibility managers rose in North Jersey, men who preferred shadows to spotlights. Newark's currents kept flowing, still shaped by long-rooted families and old associations. Across the river, leadership tremors produced their own headlines: an attempt on Costello, the fiasco at Appalachian, the downfall of Genovese, which only reinforced the value of quiet in New Jersey. The Riviera closed its chapter after fires and changing tastes, the symbol of a style of night that had defined his heyday. Clubs adapted to television, to shrinking big bands, to new sounds. Gambling adapted to new laws and new technology, always a step to the side of whatever statute tried to pin it down. Those new statutes mattered. Congress's 1,951 restriction on transporting gambling devices across state lines aimed squarely at the slot machine trade. The federal excise tax and stamp for wagers turned paperwork into a weapon against bookmakers who had once relied on local blind spots. A decade later, a law targeting interstate betting communications made the wire more dangerous to use. Later still, conspiracy and racketeering statutes offered prosecutors a way to frame a network rather than chase a single back room. None of those moves erased demand. They changed the cost of doing business and the skill set required to stay afloat. Where he had leaned on courtesy and politics to cushion risk, successors leaned harder on compartmentalization and deeper secrecy. Memory did its own work in parallel. Residents who had enjoyed lively weekends and steady entertainment remembered him as the man who kept the scene smooth. Police officers who had sparred with him privately recognized the difference between a racket run under rules that avoided public disorder and one that invited trouble out of pride or stupidity. Critics pointed out correctly that smoothing vice doesn't make it benign. The envelopes that kept inspections predictable also corroded governance. The loans that saved a club also trapped owners in cycles they could not escape. The quiet that patrons liked depended on silencing complaints and pushing decisions into rooms where voters had no say. He would have answered that people wanted what he provided. History's answer is broader. Wants and systems that meet them outside the law carry costs a community eventually pays. His family's privacy held. Even as his name hardened into a legend, relatives generally avoided public statements. Friends kept the old courtesy of leaving domestic life off the record. That restraint deepened the separation he had maintained while alive between his professional persona, jovial, ever-present, the host of 100 rooms, and the house where conversations did not include ledgers. In that separation you see a principle central to his world. Boundaries, respected until they weren't, kept everyone safer. When his own boundaries eroded under illness and fame, the world he inhabited responded the way he had trained it to respond to smaller breaches decisively, without chatter. The cultural echo persisted. Novelists and screenwriters borrowed elements of his story to sketch fictional figures who lubricated the path for singers and comics. Journalists writing about Costello could not resist the cousin in New Jersey who acted like an ambassador to show business. Profiles of Sinatra always nodded toward the rumor, even when the authors added caveats about unreliable memory. In that blending of fact and fiction, a truth survives. He stood at an intersection where entertainment, politics, and organized gambling met, and he handled that crossroads with unusual skill until the terrain changed faster than he could. Summing up his wrongdoing is not complicated, though the lines weave. He moved liquor when it was illegal, profited from gambling of many kinds when those markets lived in the shadows, placed machines where ordinances said they shouldn't be, arranged protection with officials who accepted help and looked away, controlled access to a data service that turned local betting into a coordinated business, and extended credit at rates designed for profit rather than mercy. He faced charges tied to those acts across multiple counties and from federal agencies. He beat some, paid fines on others, and never suffered a long stretch behind bars. He did all of it while projecting the image of a neighborhood character who loved music and conversation. That image was talent, not camouflage. It brought in money and kept rooms calm. It also invited attention once the medium changed. If you map his influence, you find it in how people behaved, not just where the money went. A club owner thought twice about running a game sloppy because he knew there were expectations. A patrol captain picked up a phone before planning a showy raid because he knew the fallout wouldn't be worth the photo. A band leader found that a late winter week could be saved by a crowd-boosting call. Those habits were his legacy as much as any single score. They created an equilibrium that made him valuable to bosses who liked steady revenue and to towns that preferred their nightlife lively and orderly. What would he look like in another line of work? People who knew him mused about that more than once. They pictured a union negotiator with jokes at the ready and a ledger in his head, a political fixer who showed up early to every meeting and left with everyone believing they'd gotten a fair shake, a theater impresario who could sell out a season with a few calls. He chose a path where those skills made laws feel optional. In that choice lies the story's weight. Talent can be pointed at good or ill. His talent did both at once, supporting livelihoods while eroding institutions, spreading cheer in rooms built on broken rules. In the end, his story sits with others from that era as a reminder of how adaptable vice is and how much personality can hide structure. North Jersey's nights changed shape after he was gone, but not purpose. The hum continued. Cards, calls, envelopes, songs. The best way to understand his life is to look at that hum and notice the moments when it almost went off key and then slid back into tune because someone knew which dial to turn. For years, that someone was him. When he could no longer hear the music clearly, the orchestra changed conductors. The show went on, a little less bright up front, a little more cautious in back, sustained by the habits he had taught, and undone by the visibility he could not resist. There is no epilogue that delivers poetic justice or clears the slate. There is only the record, the memories, and the lessons. The record shows a man charged repeatedly for organizing illegal gambling and related acts, linked by blood and alliance to the highest levels of a national syndicate, and slain in a manner consistent with the code of the world he served. The memories describe a host with a carnation and a grin who made hard rooms soft. The lessons warn about mistaking charm for safety and order for virtue. In the quiet after the last table is cleared, that is what remains. An American immigrant saga, whose choices bent a region's nights for a generation, whose smile lit stages he never stepped onto, and whose end drew a curtain that the audience understood without a word. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Willie Moretti here, thanking you for stepping into my world of laughter, danger, and loyalty. If this story kept you company tonight, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more tales of gangsters and forgotten empires. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Until next time, may the echoes of history fade softly into your dreams, and may the silence of the empire carry you gently into sleep. Good night,